The idea of creation out of nothing is there was a theological dispute about this in the Middle Ages within Christian theology. Some theologians, like St. Thomas Aquinas, thought that God could create the universe out of nothing. Others took the view that you couldn't create something from nothing, and God had modified what was already there. If you look at the first 2 or 3 verses of the book of Genesis, the main creation story there says, the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. And the waters there is conceived of as chaos, or the deep. Well, there are some who would say, following Aristotle, that the Spirit of God there is the creative impulse or the will, but it's already acting on something that's there, that's unformed, a potentiality, a chaotic potentiality, that therefore the creation, the giving of form to this chaotic potentiality that's already there is not creation out of nothing, it's the creation of form from potential form or from chaotic potential. So this is a long-standing dispute. In the Big Bang theory, we have a modern version of a kind of creation out of nothing, and again we have the same kinds of theoretical discussions. Some people would say there's a quantum potential that's already there, and then a bubble of this potential somehow expands to become the Big Bang. So there's already this quantum vacuum field present, which is like the Spirit of God moving on the face of the deep or of the waters. There are others who interpret it as a creation of the entire universe out of nothing. The Big Bang is the origin of everything. Well, as my friend Terence McKenna used to say that the whole universe was created out of nothing in a single instant is a kind of limit case of credulity. He said that if you can believe that, you can believe anything. And he also said that modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the free miracle is the origin of everything, the whole universe and all the laws of nature, out of nothing in a single instant. We're here in a realm of pure speculation where it's impossible to say scientifically what really happened. And I don't think that these metaphysical questions that St. Thomas Aquinas and others argued about in the 13th century have been superseded, really. They've simply taken on a new form in the guise of modern cosmology. And of course, we'll never know what really happened at the moment of the Big Bang. We only can form speculative theories about it by cranking back observations of the universe and ideas about laws of nature to that primal moment. And I'd have to say that all existing theories of cosmology and the Big Bang are based on the assumption that the laws of nature don't change and that the constants of nature are fixed. These are huge assumptions, and I myself think that the so-called laws of nature do change, they evolve, they're like habits. If you allow that, then the assumption they've always been the same as they are now, so you can just push in these equations and push the computer start button and it'll whir away and come up with what it was like at the beginning. This is not actually going to work as a method. I think we're dealing with a primal creative mystery, and our attempts to solve it in neat, simple terms are always doomed to failure. We're never going to get an unambiguous answer. Morphic resonance is the influence of similar things on subsequent similar things. Really what it's about is the resonance between patterns of organization or activity. Every cell, every organism, every crystal, every molecule has a particular pattern of rhythmic activity. And these activities are similar to previous cells, molecules, crystals, etc. of the same kind in the past. So resonance from the past to the present stabilizes forms and gives the patterns and organization of things. It gives nature its habits. I'm suggesting that the whole of nature has habits, that nature's governed by habits, not by laws. There's a kind of unconscious memory in nature, and the basis of that is morphic resonance, which works across time and space from the past to the present. I came across this because I was interested in the idea of memory. I was interested in the way that biological forms are inherited and instincts in animals. And traditional science is based on the idea that everything's governed by eternal laws, laws that are somehow beyond time and space, invisible laws of nature. But we live in an evolutionary universe, and so if we're going to have laws of nature, then why not evolving laws? After all, human laws, which is the basis of this metaphor, are not fixed, they keep changing, and they develop and they evolve. And so the laws of nature might evolve, but the very metaphor of law is very anthropomorphic, and I think the metaphor of habit is much better. I'm suggesting the whole of nature has a kind of memory, a kind of habit memory. The regularities of nature depend on habits, and those are a reflection of morphic resonance. I think there are a number of things wrong with science as we know it. Not that the things are exactly wrong, but that science is too limited, and by claiming to be more complete than it really is, this is inhibiting research. There's nothing wrong, I think, with the idea of evolution as a general principle. I'm a strong believer in the evolutionary principle. And there's nothing wrong with the idea of natural selection, which simply says that if organisms aren't very well adapted, they're going to get weeded out. This is common sense. I mean, there's nothing, in my opinion, very profound about it or very problematic. When Darwin pointed out that each oak tree has millions of seedlings and only some of them are going to grow into mature oaks, he made it clear there are strong selection pressures at work in nature. So this tells us how survival is partly a matter of luck, partly a matter of better adaptation. But it doesn't really explain where creativity comes from, how new forms arise in evolution. And the usual assumption this is just blind chance, and that everything's just a matter of random genetic mutation, is, I think, much too simple. I think that there's more to creativity than that, and this is one of the areas where I think the current paradigm is inadequate, needs to be enlarged, expanded. Also, the mechanistic assumptions of modern biology, I think, are very limiting. What they do is say that all organisms can be understood in terms of one metaphor, the metaphor of the machine. I think it's much better to think of living organisms as what they are, namely living organisms. Organisms are not the same as machines. What makes an organism different from a machine is that an organism builds itself, organizes itself, it's self-organizing, whereas machines are not self-organizing, they're built in factories, they're designed by people. The intelligence, the organizing principles of a machine are outside it in a human mind. The purposes of the machine are outside it in a human mind. But an organism is self-organizing, it builds itself up from simple beginnings and through growing and developing, whereas a machine is put together from external parts. So the machine metaphor can be helpful for some things. The eye is a little bit like a camera, the heart is a little bit like a pump. These kinds of analogies can be useful, they're helpful as far as they go, but they don't really get to the essence of what a living organism is. Therefore, I think this mechanistic assumption of conventional biology, together with all the terminology that goes with it, biotechnology, genetic engineering, factory farming, treating organisms as machines is actually a very old-fashioned way of thinking about them. We need to get back to the idea of living organisms as living organisms and find out just what life and organization really involves. The term creode is a technical term introduced into developmental biology by the British biologist C.H. Waddington, who is a professor of biology at Edinburgh University. He introduced this term in the 1950s. He was convinced, as many other biologists are, that we need a field concept to understand living organization, that as an organism develops, it's guided and shaped by a field within and around it, a morphogenetic field, a field that shapes form. Morphe means form, genesis means coming into being. A morphogenetic field is concerned with the coming into being of form. But the interesting thing about biological development is that things develop towards a goal. As an embryo develops, it's growing towards an adult organism of its species. if you cut a little bit off an embryo, typically the rest of the embryo adjusts and produces a normal organism anyway. It's as if the end, the goal, is fixed, and the organism can get there by different routes if necessary. And the pathway of development, Waddington compared to a valley, the ball rolling along a valley towards the end of the valley. He called that the epigenetic landscape, the developmental pathway. And this developmental pathway the organism follows is what he calls a creode. It's a path of change, a necessary path of change. It leads towards a goal or an end, the adult organism, or the adult form of a limb like a leg or an arm, for example. And this creode analogy makes it clear that the ball doesn't have to roll along the bottom of the valley. If you change the path of the ball on a valley, if you push a ball up the side of one of the walls of the valley, so it's gone where it doesn't normally go, and then you let go of it, it will again roll down to the bottom of the valley and get to the same end point. So Waddington was trying to make it clear that there is an end or a goal in developmental processes within the morphogenetic field, and the term creode is a term implying a direction of development towards that end or goal. I think each individual organism has a morphic field which organizes its activity. So a chicken or a kangaroo or even a snow crystal has a morphic field which shapes the organism as it develops and which helps maintain its form. These fields are local. They're within and around the organism they're organizing. I have a field, the field's within me and around me, just as a magnetic field is within and around a magnet, or the field of a cell phone is within and around the cell phone, or the Earth's gravitational field is within and around the Earth. Those fields are local and they organize the individual organism. However, the memory that's inherent in these fields, the influence from the past, is non-local, and that depends on morphic resonance. It can come from anywhere in the world or anywhere in the past. So each field has a kind of cumulative memory. Each individual animal or plant draws on a collective memory of the species and in turn contributes to it. So the field is shaped by influences from other organisms in the past. But once it's organizing a particular organism, it's in and around that organism. Consciousness is one of the greatest problems and enigmas for science and philosophy, and thousands of books have been written on this subject. I don't pretend to understand it. I think it's one of the great challenges for us. It's the thing we take for granted. Without consciousness we can't think or do science or philosophy or just lead normal lives. So the most obvious thing is in a way the most hard to understand. What we do know is that a large part of our mind is unconscious. Many of our forms of behavior are habits, and these habits are largely unconscious. Consciousness seems to be concerned with possibilities and choices. And it's not involved in things which proceed automatically. If I'm riding a bicycle, for example, and I know how to ride well, I've done it for years, I don't need to think about it. I just do it. I'm aware, of course, of the scenery around me, what's happening on the road, if cars are coming and so forth, but I can be thinking about something else. All that very complicated organization is happening more or less habitually and unconsciously, including my perceptual awareness of what's going on, because I can consciously be thinking about something totally different, what I'm going to write in a book, or what I'm going to say to a friend, or where I'm going to go tomorrow, that kind of thing. So I think consciousness is typically concerned with choices among possibilities. The way in which it works is through the fields which interact with our brains, the morphic fields of behavior. Many of them are unconscious and habitual. So consciousness is like a field of fields, or a realm of possibility, which we inhabit. It's different, therefore, from the regular habits of nature. And it's something which exists in a kind of virtual space, because possibilities are virtual. They're not the same as actualities. Of the many possible things we could do or say, we say just one, or do just one if we have to make a choice. There is a similarity in that to some of the processes in quantum physics, in that when we calculate what a particle like an electron or a photon can do, the equations give us a whole range of possibilities. And when you measure what the particle is doing, all these possibilities suddenly collapse. The particle's here instead of all the other places it could have been. This is sometimes called the collapse of the wave function. And what it means is that out of the many possibilities that were there, one thing happens, not the others. I think consciousness in that sense is analogous. It's to do with many possibilities. As soon as we make a decision or a choice, as soon as I use one word rather than another word, all these possibilities collapse into that form of behavior or act. So in that sense they're analogous. Now whether this is pointing to some deeper connection, whether it's just an analogy, or whether there's some deep quantum physics basis for consciousness is another question. Quite a lot of people think that because we don't really understand quantum physics and we don't really understand consciousness, they must be the same thing. I don't really take that view. Quantum physics is rather limited. It deals with microscopic particles, and quantum physics isn't even very good at explaining complicated molecules. So to assume that this microphysics can immediately explain consciousness seems to me unlikely. But it may be that both of them are reflecting field-like processes, morphic fields as I think of them in the brain and in organisms, may be similar at the very microscopic level to quantum fields. It may be they are related, but I don't think we're likely to arrive at an understanding of consciousness by starting with the physics of electrons or of small subatomic particles. It's starting with things that are much too small, at a much too smaller level of analysis. So there are useful analogies, but I don't think that we're going to understand our own minds just by looking at the equations of quantum theory. Fields are always known through their effects. Most fields are invisible. The gravitational field, for example, is known through its effects. I'm sitting on a chair now rather than floating about because I'm held in place by an invisible field, the gravitational field. And we know it's there precisely because it has gravitational effects. We can't measure the gravitational field directly through electromagnetism, for example. We can measure it through a weighing machine or through a pendulum swinging. There are various indirect ways of measuring it, but we don't see it. Now the same is true of magnetic fields. If you don't have any magnetic particles around, or electrical particles that interact with magnetic fields, you don't know it's there. It's an invisible field. If you look at the field around a magnet and you put iron filings there, you can then see that field. You can manifest the lines of force. They're there even if you haven't put anything there to show them. Now, morphic fields are detected through their effects like every other kind of field. We don't detect electromagnetic fields through gravitation, we detect them through electromagnetic effects. We detect gravitational fields through gravitational effects. And we detect morphic fields through morphic effects, which are to do with organization, form, pattern, structure. And there are a variety of ways in which we can detect these effects. One way that I've been investigating is that I think these fields connect together members of social groups, organisms that are bonded to each other, animals that are part of the same group, or people that are bonded through friendship or family ties, and that these connections operate at a distance. And I think these are the basis for telepathy. So we can do experiments to test whether telepathy exists or not, and we can find conditions that make it stronger or weaker. And in that way we can measure effects of morphic fields. It's an indirect test. But we have to have indirect tests. I don't think we're going to have an electrical meter that you switch on and turn a dial and measure the morphic field. It's not the way you measure gravitational fields, it's the way you measure electromagnetic fields with electromagnetic meters. So unless morphic fields interact with electromagnetic fields in some clearly detectable way, which is not known at present, we wouldn't be able to measure them through an electromagnetic meter. Electromagnetic fields and morphic fields no doubt do react, they interact. They interact in visual perception, for example. The electromagnetic field coming into the eyes and forming images on the retina is related to the perceptual field through which we see images. Our conscious experience of the world around us as we look at things is an interaction between these fields. But we don't know enough about the interaction between these fields to set up machines that would measure them at the moment. I'm not saying this is impossible, I'm just saying I don't know of any method at present. Some people think that Kirlian photography is a way of doing this, but I'm just not sure if that's true or not. Kirlian photography is a form of image making where you have high voltage discharges between metallic plates, and some people think that you can put a leaf or something in between and measure the field of the leaf. The trouble with that kind of measurement is that Kirlian photography depends on moisture. You can put a piece of damp blotting paper in and take a Kirlian photograph and you get a kind of aura around the blotting paper. That doesn't mean to say it's got a field, it just means it's giving off moisture, and the moisture is causing the electrical field to break down more easily near the damp object. So attempts of that kind to measure these fields, in my opinion, are not yet convincing. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm saying that I don't know of a method of doing it now. Morphic resonance means that in the course of nature, if a new thing appears in one place, then it'll be easier for it to appear somewhere else. The more often it appears, the easier it will become. So if you make a new crystal, it should get easier to crystallize the same compound. The more often you make it, the easier it should get all around the world. There's some evidence that that happens. In the realm of behavior, it means if you teach an animal a new trick, or if an animal learns a new trick spontaneously, if that spreads in the animal population, the more animals that do it, the easier it should get to do the same thing elsewhere. These are implications of morphic resonance, and these are testable. There's already evidence that this kind of process goes on. There are laboratory experiments with rats which show that the rate of learning of the new trick increased all over the world. There's a story very commonly told, the so-called 100th monkey story, which is saying much the same kind of thing. I myself never used that story because it's not very well documented. The story started with Lyle Watson, the writer, who in his book Life told about research on monkeys in Japan. Japanese researchers noticed that in monkey colonies they were studying, sometimes new behavior would start and then it would spread by imitation through the colony. One form of behavior was they fed sweet potatoes to the monkeys, and they gave them to the monkeys on the sand, on the beach. So these were covered with sand, and one monkey discovered they could wash the sand off, others copied it, and then they noticed that on other islands, when they fed sweet potatoes to monkeys, after a certain point, animals seemed to be learning to do this as well. Now, this is what was actually observed by Japanese scientists, but it was sort of anecdotal. It wasn't quantifiably written up in journals in a quantitative way. Lyle Watson tells this story, and he says, let us imagine, for the purpose of argument, that on a certain day, another monkey, let us say the 100th monkey, learned this, then suddenly everywhere monkeys were doing the same thing. He makes it clear he's making it up. He's turning an observation into a good story by giving details that he's made up. He says he's making them up. That story has then been repeated by New Age mythologers and inspirational group leaders and that kind of thing, who've heard it from other ones, and each time it's like Chinese whispers. It gets distorted and improved, and so the story, as I usually hear it told, bears no relation to the original story, except you've got monkeys. Some people tell it these monkeys started digging up these things that had been growing there for years and washing them, and that it all spread suddenly on a particular day. Everywhere, they were all doing it everywhere. This was made up by Lyle Watson to make it a better story. He makes it clear in his book that he's not guilty of any misrepresentation because he makes it clear what he's doing. But these improved versions of the 100th monkey story have drifted so far away from the scientific factual base that then the skeptics move in and they say this is complete nonsense, the 100th monkey story just isn't true, it's just a myth, the entire phenomenon is nonsense. So, unfortunately, although I think the principle this story is representing is an important principle, it's the kind of morphic resonance principle, that story itself is a very weak piece of evidence, precisely because it's been so exaggerated, mistold, and drifted so far away from documented facts. I think that flocks of birds and schools of fish, in fact all animal groups, have a field that organizes the society. Morphic fields organize self-organizing systems, and self-organizing systems are arranged in a nested hierarchy. In cells there are organelles which organize themselves, like mitochondria. Cells are self-organizing. Cells are in tissues which are self-organizing. Those are in organs. The organs are in organisms. At every level there's a field for the whole system which organizes the parts, and those parts are themselves whole systems with fields organizing parts. When we get to social groups like flocks of birds or schools of fish, the individual organisms are in a larger field, the field of the whole group, and that field organizes their behavior. So in that sense, the behavior of a flock of birds turning at almost the same time, or a school of fish responding rapidly, changing direction without bumping into each other, these are field phenomena governed by morphic fields. We can call it the group field. When we're thinking about the life of nature, we have to realize there's a distinction between biological life and what may be another form of life. I mean, the biological life involves certain criteria like growth and reproduction and excretion and death and so on. Now, on those criteria, if people say that the planet Earth is alive, Gaia is a living organism, there are some people who would say, oh, it's not a living organism because it's not reproducing, it's not having baby Earths, and it's not having sexual reproduction and so on. That, I think, is a very limited conception of life. In ancient Greece, they had two names for life. One, Zoe, means life in a more general sense, and the other one, bios, means biological life. Biological life is one form of life, but all traditional cosmologies saw the whole universe as alive, the whole universe as having a soul, the anima mundi, the soul of the world. In Neoplatonic philosophy, the entire universe had this soul that held everything in place and kept it all together. In modern cosmology, we have the universal gravitational field that holds everything together and keeps it in place and provides the framework of space and time. And maybe these unified fields, the field of the whole universe, how do we know that the gravitational field of the entire universe is dead? How do we know that the whole universe is just a machine? In fact, if we look at the images we have, the old image of the universe, from the old cosmology up until 1960s, was the universe as a big machine, slowly running out of steam, a kind of clockwork machine or a machine of some kind. Since the 1960s, with the Big Bang Theory, we've had a much more organic view of the universe. The universe begins very small and very hot, and as it expands, it cools down, and as it cools down, new things appear within it. Subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, gases, stars, galaxies, planets, and biological life on at least this planet. So we have a long cosmic evolutionary process going on for something like 15 billion years. And all the time the universe is getting bigger and new things are happening within it. Now this is much more like the development of an organism than like any machine that we've ever come across. It's as if the entire universe is a developing organism, and the Big Bang is rather like those ancient cosmological myths of the hatching of the cosmic egg. So I think that we've actually got an implicitly organic view of the entire universe. We have good reasons for thinking the whole Earth could be like a living organism. Probably the whole solar system can be seen of as a kind of organism. The entire galaxy would be a kind of higher level organism. So if we take the organismic or holistic view of nature, at every level of organization we find a larger system that's itself organized. So within the Earth is one level of organization, then there's the solar system, then there's the galaxy, then there are clusters of galaxies, then there's the entire universe as the ultimate level of organization. At every level we have self-organizing systems, wholes which include the parts. And I think if we think of these as organisms, then we can see that the whole of nature can be thought of as alive, as made up of levels of living organization. One particular kind of living organization goes in cycles of birth and death and reproduction and so on, and that's biological organization. But this is not the only form in which organization, living organization, is found in nature. But the other forms of organization, like the organization of the sun, the solar system, the earth, I think these are living in a general sense that they're self-organizing wholes. Of course, in all traditional cultures, they've been thought of as alive. You know, the Greeks, the Indians with the sun god Surya, they think that the sun is alive, traditional societies. And in traditional thought, life has not been necessarily coupled to biological reproduction. People don't think the sun's alive because it has baby sons or gets married or something like that. They think the sun's alive because it's a self-organizing system which exhibits the properties of spontaneous autonomy and self-organization, which are deeper qualities of life than biological reproduction. I think all animals must have some kind of imagination. I mean, at least mammals, many of them dream. We know that dogs and cats can dream. We don't know what they dream about, but sometimes when a dog's dreaming, it seems as if it's running, and it seems as if it's chasing something in its dream. So there's a form of imagination that occurs spontaneously in a great many mammals, not just human beings, which is dreaming. Our dreams, even in young children, even in babies before birth, in embryos, appear to have the capacity to dream. Now, what they dream about would be fascinating to know, because they've as yet had no external experience of the world. But those of us who have, in our dreams, some of the imagery we get is based on things we've seen or our experience. These images can be changed and combined in the most extraordinary ways over which we have almost no conscious control. Our dreams are often surprising, and we can go much further and do much more surprising things through our dreams than by sitting down consciously thinking about something. So this capacity for forming images, combining and making new images, is, I think, intrinsic in the way that mammals' minds work, not just people. In people, we've developed this further, this capacity to use and change images, to use imagination, not just through visual imagination, but through verbal imagination. Because we have language, we can go beyond what most animals can do, and our imagination can combine words we can have internal dialogues, we can think of new patterns of words, we can think of things we could have said or might want to say, or ideas that we can express in the form of words that we could write down. And that's the basis of the huge amount of creativity that comes out in books. Visual artists mostly use visual imagination, of course, in order to produce new forms, shapes, sculptures, buildings, etc. And then we have the imagination that occurs with sounds, and which can be realized through music and the creative power of music. This, again, is not something confined to human beings. If you listen to blackbirds singing here in England, they're our most beautiful singing birds. They have a most wonderful song. Each time a bird sings, the same bird sings, it's different. It has a different combination of sounds. And it goes on for quite a long time. I mean, it's extraordinarily beautiful. And presumably, these birds are combining sounds they've heard before, but bringing them out in new ways. We know that some birds can learn the songs they have, and cowbirds and mockingbirds are well-known examples, where they put together songs by picking up fragments of songs from other birds, from other species, and combining them in new ways. So there's a kind of creative imagination at work in different realms: auditory, linguistic, visual, and practical, because there are forms of imagination involved in making things, in making new tools. People who are very good with their hands at making things may see things and imitate them without necessarily forming a clear image in their mind. They just somehow do it. And then there's physical skills. We can watch people through the different ways of throwing things, jumping, running, playing in games, skills involved in new sports like skateboarding and so forth. People can watch those, they can imitate them, and they can imagine new forms, new tricks. And so we have many, many forms of creativity going on in the human realm, not necessarily visual. And I think that what we're seeing here is something which is taken much further and happening much faster than is happening elsewhere in the animal realm. But there's a kind of creativity present in all of nature which enables new forms to appear. In plants, we've got an astonishing range of flowers and leaf forms in the flowering plants. In the course of evolution, all of those have appeared somehow for the first time. We don't know anything about the imagination of the plant kingdom or how this production of new forms takes place, whether it takes place in some kind of conscious plant mind, or much more likely unconscious, a bit more analogous to our dreams, and somehow there's something in a plant that's in an unstable state where it can't form its normal flowers for some reason or other, and there's a new possibility opens up, and out of the many possible things a new kind of flower appears. And if this survives by natural selection, we could have, the origin of new floral forms. Plant breeders are doing this all the time in developing new varieties of roses and mutant forms of flowers and new kinds of fruit. So we see this going on all the time, but we don't know how these new forms appear in plants, but they certainly do. So you could say there's a kind of creative imagination at work all through nature, and that this reaches a more conscious form in human beings. But even in human beings, even the most creative people don't know how the creativity happens. They say, it just came to me, or I saw it in a flash. They're not necessarily conscious of how their creative processes are working. There are different metaphors of creativity, and the two main metaphors are that creativity wells up from below. The Jungian psychologists like that idea, that there's things going on in the unconscious mind, and they well up from the unconscious and come to the surface of consciousness. There could be a eureka moment. You suddenly have some insight that has been generated while you've been asleep even, or through a dream, or in a process that you have no conscious knowledge of. That's the welling up from below theory. There may be a lot of truth in it. But the other theory of creativity that we always come across is that it comes down from above, that you have a descent from above, from a higher source. And the traditional theory of creativity in the West has been that you have higher sources of intelligence. The Greeks thought of them as muses. Each different art had a muse, which was a kind of intelligence, a guiding intelligence, the muse of music, for example. And we inspired people to think up new tunes. There were muses of lyric poetry. There were 9 muses. And with the word muse comes out in our word museum and in music. The idea was there was a creative source at a higher level than the human. And the Romans thought that people had a guardian spirit, a genius. The word genius means spirit. That spoke through them or worked through them. In Christian terms, these became angels, inspiring angels, and guardian angels. And the idea of inspiration directly from God through the Holy Spirit is fundamental in the entire Christian tradition. So there are higher sources as well as lower sources. Creativity can come from above or from below, maybe from both together. Things welling up from our own individual unconscious or from a higher level of inspiration. And if we look at the organization of nature, we find at every level any given system is within a larger system. Human beings are not mere individuals, we're part of social groups, cultural groups, the whole of humanity. And it may be if a human being has some inspired idea, perhaps it's coming from the sort of collective spirit of humanity. And humanity is embedded in the entire ecology of the Earth. So we're all part of a much larger system, the Earth. How do we know that some inspiration isn't coming from Gaia, the creative spirit of the Earth, or the solar system of which the Earth is part, or the galaxy? There are always larger systems in which everything is embedded, and those too could be sources of creativity that work through individuals. That's a much more traditional view than the Jungian view that it's just the individual. But even Jung thought that the unconscious was not purely individual, that there was a collective unconscious as well. So in any unconscious processing there would be a collective as well as an individual element. The fact is that we don't really know, but people who are very creative don't know either. And we can't really tell from the fact you get a flash and an inspiration, a eureka moment. Has it come from some source of inspiration above us, from some unconscious welling up below us? Who knows? It's a great mystery. It's interesting that in this very individualistic period we live in, people tend to think of it as happening inside individual minds or even inside individual brains. When people say Einstein was a genius, they attribute the whole creativity to Einstein himself. But in the more classical European terminology, people would have said Einstein had a genius, a spirit that inspired him. People like Mozart thought they were inspired by spirits, and great poets like Milton, John Milton, the 17th century English poet, at the beginning of his epic poem Paradise Lost, has an invocation to the spirit, just like classical authors invoke the muse at the beginning of the poem. His poem starts, "Sing, heavenly muse," and he's talking about the Holy Spirit as the inspiring source of his verse, and he has an invocation asking for this inspiration. On the basis of my theory of morphic resonance, I think we all tune in to influences from the past and from other people. Normally there's a kind of collective memory on which we draw. I think it's conceivable that some people in some areas are particularly well tuned to creative people in the past or even in the present, and have a sort of tremendous influence which gives them skills beyond their normal level of their age and enables them to become prodigies in certain areas. I think it's more a matter of tuning into capacities that are already established within humanity, rather than some mutation inside their own brain. I think our normal abilities to learn depend on this collective memory, and if there's some particular focus in a particular person in a particular area, you could have extraordinary capacities, even though the rest of their mental development may be merely normal or even beneath the normal or below the normal, and this seems to be a well-known phenomenon. I think the rise of neo-shamanism is particularly interesting, and the interest in shamanism that we have in the modern world. I haven't personally met very many shamans, but I did have a wonderful experience of actually living with one in the jungles of Orissa in India. A friend of mine was an anthropologist living with a remote tribe there, a tribal culture. He was staying with the shaman, and I actually stayed with an actual shaman in a village. And that actually gave me a lot more feeling for what's going on than reading many books about the subject. What became clear to me, both from reading and from my experience of this shaman and others who I've met in the United States and elsewhere, was that shamans are kind of bridge figures. They're a bridge between the human community and other realms. One other realm is the realm of the dead, so one of the roles of the shaman is to go into trance and to act as a medium through which the ancestors or the dead can speak to the living. But they're also, and I think perhaps more interestingly, the intermediates between the human society and the natural world around them. This particular shaman, like shamans in those tribal cultures in central India, didn't live in the village itself. he lived on the top of a cliff away from the main village on the edge of the forest, and he literally lived on the frontier of the wild. And he knew much more about animals and plants than other people. He was the bridge between them and nature. And a traditional role of shamans in hunter-gatherer societies is to know what to gather and to have a kind of inspiration about the plant kingdom, but also, and at least as important, perhaps more so, to have an understanding of animals and animal spirits, where animals are, how to hunt the animals, where to find animals for hunting, and how to maintain the right kind of balance between the human and the animal worlds. So they're like intermediates between the human and the non-human realms. And by going into trance and being open to visionary experiences, they're able to connect the rest of the community with these other realms. So they're intermediates. They're often people who are somewhat abnormal psychologically, and of course some shamanic traditions involve the taking of psychedelic drugs which open up these visionary realms and open up these doorways to other realms of reality or experience. So I think this rise in shamanism comes in part through a need to reconnect with these other realms of nature. I think that this also lies at the root of organized religions. I mean, at the heart of every religious tradition we find an experience of these other realms, or many experiences. In some ways Jesus was like a shaman. He had healing powers, he had visions of other realms. In the Christian creed, it talks about his journey down into the underworld after the crucifixion. In English we say he descended into hell, on the third day he rose again and ascended to heaven. So this idea of a journey into the underworld and a journey into the heavenly realms is a very classic shamanic theme found in many parts of the world. The Buddha, in his enlightenment, was sitting under a tree, and he went through various forms of asceticism and living in forests with Indian hermits. They typically live in wild nature to seek for their inspiration. His final enlightenment happened sitting under a peepal tree, a sacred tree. Again, a very shamanic theme. So we can find, I think, in the large organized religions, many of these themes. Muhammad is supposed to have channeled the Quran and undergone these mysterious flights from one place to another, and had encounters with angels who revealed things to him. So the founders of all the great religions, and the Hindu sages and sannyasins, are visionaries who, you could say, take the shamanic thing a step further, and it puts it in a more codified form, and then it gets written down in books and becomes the basis of an institutionalized form of religion. I think organized human cultures probably need institutional forms of religion with the rituals and the seasonal festivals that hold the community together and bind the whole social life to the cycles of nature, as our festivals still do in the Christian world or in the Jewish world or in the Muslim world. The Muslim world's interesting actually because those festivals shift around the year and don't have a close relationship to the solar cycles of nature, but are directly linked to a lunar calendar, so they're much more in tune with the lunar rhythms than other religions, which are more solar in their seasonal calendars. So I think that the shamanic impulse and the shamanic experience is probably far older. Well, everyone agrees it's far older than that of institutional or organized religions. And it's this direct experience which I think is at the heart of all religion and all religious insight. And that's the starting point, I think, for all kinds of religion, and it can be continually renewed through personal experience and is being renewed again today. Well, I don't like to talk about the future. I'm not a prophet. I think that everybody knows within our civilization there are some forces working for better understanding, enlightenment, greater love, cooperation, caring for others, help, and so forth. There are also forces that are encouraging human greed, envy, destruction, anger. Traditional human vices, what in the Christian tradition are called the 7 deadly sins, some of those are now seen as virtues. Greed and envy are the engines that propel the consumer society, and they're fanned up by the advertising industry. They're the basis of growing economies and consequently of the destruction of the environment. Now, it's always been hard for all religions and all social culture traditions to keep greed and envy in their place. They're kept in place by strong social forces in a tribal society. We've broken down those traditional restraints, and now we have untrammeled, uncontrolled greed and envy with huge financial forces and all the persuasive power of the advertising industry and the media, which is largely propelled through the advertising industry and funded through it, taking over the whole world. I mean, consumerism is now conquering India and China and virtually everywhere else in the world. So you could say that this is a pretty gloomy prospect. And we have global warming and all these other well-known environmental problems. I think I'm fairly pessimistic about rational reform. If politicians get together and say we're going to control global warming and we'll have these international agreements and do it seriously, that would be wonderful. There's not much hope of that happening. They've tried, and George W. Bush doesn't want to go along with it. Different countries have all got their own agendas. They're all thinking in short-term time scales, as politicians inevitably do. It's not going to be reformed, I think, by just reason and science. There may be a fuel crisis, oil may get vastly more expensive, then people have to behave differently. But I think if there's any hope, it's going to come about through the Earth itself imposing limits on what we can do. And that may be painful, destructive, and very disruptive to our present system. No, so I can't give any clear prophecies as which way it's going to go. And the most interesting thing about the future and predictions is that if you look at the past about people's predictions, they're so often wrong. So many unexpected things happen. We just don't know, what's going to happen next. Who foresaw the tsunami, for example? And there are always shocks, always surprises in the historical process. When we come to science and education, I think the present system of doing science and science education is sadly lacking in many ways. First of all, institutional science has become more and more centralized and controlled, and increasingly controlled by international companies and corporations. Governments now make science funding dependent, in many cases, on an interest from some industries. So the government's simply helping corporations in their science agendas. This means many people now see science as a servant of corporate and government interests, not an independent exploration of nature by fearless individuals, but rather as simply a way of increasing the control over natural resources by oil companies, Monsanto, other genetic engineering companies, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. So unfortunately, this has led to a widespread public disillusionment with science. It's also, among scientists themselves, made science much less interesting to do. Scientists are now kept on short leashes. They have to keep reapplying for grants. If they don't do grants and apply in fashionable areas, they're not going to get the grants in most cases. Real independence is greatly reduced. There are very few scientists working independently any longer. In the 19th century, this was normal. Charles Darwin never had a grant or an academic job, for example. And he probably couldn't have done what he did if he'd had to apply for grants to government committees, because what he did was going against the prevailing orthodoxy. Many scientists in the past who were independent and creative were creative precisely because they were independent. The number of really independent scientists today is vanishingly small, and most are now working for governments or corporations directly or indirectly. That's a really bad thing, and one solution that I'm suggesting, one way of dealing with this, a tiny way of dealing with it, is the proposal that 1% of government science budget should go to pay for research that actually interests taxpayers, that people should have a say in what research is done. For example, in Britain, the Medical Research Council spends £700 million a year on medical research. The people who decide include representatives of biotech and drug companies, and it's all done on conventional medicine. None, practically none, on alternative or complementary medicine. They're not interested in that. But millions of taxpayers are interested in that. So why shouldn't 1% of the medical budget be spent on exploring and comparing different alternative and complementary forms of medicine? In other areas, I think people could suggest areas that they'd like to see scientific research done in, which might be very different from the corporate agendas and government agendas that are being pursued at the moment. So I think by opening up a tiny fraction of science to participation by the public and democratic input, show that it could be done differently. It doesn't have to be done in this centralized, bureaucratic, institutional way it's now done in. It wasn't done that way even until the Second World War. It's really only since then that we've had the present system. It was much freer and much more decentralized before. I think science education would benefit from an opening up of science, because right now it's a matter of learning facts, cramming for exams, and it's terribly boring, and young people are turning away from science in large numbers. In Britain here, there's been a steady decline over many years of people doing especially physics and chemistry. University chemistry departments are closing. More than 20 have closed in the last 10 years. So we have things running down. Anyway, I think we need a reform of science, and I think science education and bringing more adventurous science into schools can be done. I have several experiments myself which are now available on the internet, which are being done in schools, which bring leading-edge research on controversial issues right into the capacity of school children and students. And I think this is one way forward that could make science much more fun and enable students to participate in the leading-edge research and in big questions about where we're going, how our minds work, and so on. Positive thing about science is that it can explore new phenomena. It's not bound, it's not a dogmatic system, or shouldn't be. It can easily become a dogmatic orthodoxy, but science is always regenerated through the discovery of new areas. And the nature of our own minds, I think, is the great new frontier for science. Luckily, many of the experiments that can be done are cheap, simple, and many people can participate in this new wave of scientific discovery and exploration.